Welcome, everyone. This is Dhaiphong. You're tuning in to another live stream, and we have a very special show today because we are going to be joined by returning guest BEN NORTON of Geopolitical Economy Report. There's breaking news about the assassination of Igor Kirillov, and we are going to get into this as well as the deeper preparations to war that the United States and NATO are making with Russia in the lead up to Trump 2.0. We're also going to get deep into Syria, Assad speaking for the first time since he was deposed. And we are going to get into the deeper meaning of all of these things with BEN NORTON, who joins me now. Ben, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Danny.
Of course, everyone. Be sure to hit the like button before we get started. Also, you can find Ben's channel, Geopolitical Economy Report, which you should all be subscribed to in the video description below, and all the places to support this channel as well. But we're going to get started. Ben, I wanted to talk to you about this recent development in Moscow. The most high-level official yet to be taken out in so-called decapitation strike. Ukrainian SBU put Igor Kirillov, the head of the Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Weapons Division in the Defense Ministry. He was murdered on December 16th by a terrorist attack, a bomb detonated from, I believe, a scooter outside of a residential building in Moscow. Now, this comes, Ben, and I want to play this for you. You know, there's been a lot of talk, NATO talking about war preparations with Russia. Now, Vladimir Putin and Andrei Belousov met with the entirety of the defense ministry on December 16th, and Putin had this to say, and I wanted to play this before I get your comments. So he talked about pushing red lines, and here is his warning. I'm just going to play about a minute of this.
We see that the current administration of the United States and practically the entire collective West do not abandon their attempts to maintain their global dominance. They continue to impose their so-called rules on the world community, which they change time and again, distorting them as it suits them. Well, strictly speaking, they have only one stable rule: no rules for those who do this. For those who consider themselves at the head of the whole world, for those who consider themselves representatives of God on earth, although they themselves do not fear God. And against unwanted states they wage hybrid wars, implement a policy of containment, including with respect to Russia, in an effort to weaken our country, to inflict a strategic defeat on us. The United States continues to pump the de facto illegitimate ruling regime in Kiev with weapons and money. They send mercenaries and military advisors, and thus they encourage further escalation of the conflict. At the same time, under the pretext of a mythical Russian threat, they simply frighten their population by saying that we are going to attack someone, because their tactics are very simple. They bring us to the red line, across which we can no longer retreat. We begin to respond to them, and they immediately frighten their population with the former Soviet and now Russian threat.
So, Ben, I wanted to play that because at the same time that they were meeting with the defense ministry, Vladimir Putin and Andrei Belousov, talking about preparing for war with NATO and pushing red lines, we had this attack. So your thoughts and your comments on where this attack fits into this broader, it seems like, build-up and escalation that we've been seeing entering into Trump 2.0.
Yeah, well, it's more of the same. I mean, it's clear that Ukraine has lost this war, and as they have lost, they've become more and more desperate and have engaged in these kinds of attacks where they're just killing top-level officials in Russia. And of course, if Ukraine did this, it was with the support of they said that they did this. And when they do these kinds of things, they do so with the support of the United States. Ukraine does not make these kinds of important decisions without getting approval from Washington. We've seen this again and again, where every month or two, they keep moving further and further up the escalation ladder, and they have to ask for approval from the White House. And so, for instance, before this, the latest escalation was that Ukraine is now using long-range missiles that were provided by the US in order to strike deep into Russian territory. But again, I mean, they've lost this war. If you read mainstream Western media outlets, they're finally acknowledging that Ukraine, that is NATO, has lost. So before it's inevitable that this war has to come to an end, they continue to kill Russian officials, trying to pressure Russia to essentially give them what NATO wants, which Russia is not going to accept. And we can hear that very clearly in Putin's speech there. And that's an important speech also because he's putting the context of the war in a much larger overall situation, which is not just about Ukraine. It's about the US-led West truly thinks that it rules the entire world. They talk about their so-called rules-based international order in which they make the rules. They order everyone around. As he said, they think that they're the gods of the world. When he said those comments, it reminded me of American exceptionalism and how every US president says, we are the greatest country in history ever created. I mean, that is a kind of religious view that we are the best thing ever in human history and no one can be better than us. And that is such a common view. In fact, if you're a politician in the US and you don't say that, you're attacked as a traitor because you're not this extreme supremacist, I mean, who sees yourself truly as the God on earth. So I personally, I know that there are a lot of people who always like to say, oh, there's so much more escalation, it's going to be World War III. And I actually don't think at that point. I think there were several moments in the past 2 years that were very dangerous. And fortunately, we did not go into World War III, which would be disastrous. I think ultimately these are signs of Ukrainian desperation and by extension, NATO desperation.
Yeah, and this gentleman, Igor Kirillov, he is one who was just targeted by Ukraine itself, accused of chemical warfare on the battlefront, accused of facilitating it. Russia denies this. But one thing we do know about Mr. Kirillov is that he was deeply open about the preparations Ukraine was making with NATO help around using and utilizing chemical warfare, biological warfare, particularly through earlier in the conflict, these bio labs, etc. Could you talk about that and even just this use of this kind of terrorism and what it says about Ukraine and NATO? You said that World War III isn't right around the corner. And at the same time, it feels like there is this attempt to keep the escalations going and to keep this conflict going.
Well, yeah, because they lost. I mean, it's so funny. You read Politico, which is basically the voice of the US government. And Politico has published multiple articles saying Ukraine lost. This has been acknowledged by many mainstream media outlets in the West. So when you have lost in a war like this, you can either just surrender and then give the other side all of what they demand, or you can just lash out and engage in these extreme acts of provocation and just terrorism, assassinating top government officials, military commanders. That's what they're doing because they can't actually win the war. So while, for instance, in Ukraine, they're under US pressure, they're changing the policy to now to push 18-year-olds into the meat grinder of war. For people who don't know what I'm referring to, Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, publicly revealed after a series of reports that he has been pressuring Ukraine to reduce the age of conscription down to 18. Because previously, Ukraine was saying, well, we don't want to destroy our entire generation of the youth. So instead, the average age of people was in the 40s on the front line, the Ukrainian fighters. Now they're conscripting 18-year-olds and people in their early 20s. So clearly, again, this is a sign of desperation that they've clearly lost. So what they can do is continue to carry out acts of terror, targeted assassinations against top Russian officials, because they think that this could be a way to try to maximize their leverage. At this point, when you're losing a war, you have to think about ways that the war will end. Realistically, they're not going to defeat Russia. NATO has lost. So their goal is to cause as much damage as they can to the Russian government, to Russian leadership. The EU just announced another package of sanctions against Russia. This is the 15th package. I mean, what are they going to? They're going to sanction the last the bread, like a bakery or whatever, or grocery store that they haven't sanctioned. I mean, it's like a joke at this point. They're just trying to find new things to sanction because, as they often boast, Russia is now the most sanctioned country on earth. So they're just trying to keep pushing the pressure because they know at some point very soon they're going to have to come to the negotiating table and come to some kind of agreement. Now, what that agreement looks like, I think, is still very much in the air. I honestly do not see some kind of formal agreement likely. I think what's more likely is the Korea War situation, where they essentially freeze the conflict and there's a de facto recognition that the Donbass is part of Russia. And there's a de facto recognition that Ukraine will not be in NATO. But I mean, do you really think, I don't think that Europe would be willing to sign any agreement like that. And now with Trump coming in, it's impossible to predict. Trump said, not only did he claim during the campaign that he would end it, he actually claimed that even before he became president, that the war would end. Well, that's looking like it's not going to happen. And then he said he would do it on day one. That's not going to happen either. And a lot of the people around Trump are very hawkish, especially Marco Rubio, who will be the head of the State Department. And of course, most of the people in Trump's cabinet that he has nominated so far are extreme anti-China hawks. But Rubio is also very anti-Russia. Right. And Trump's national security advisor pick, Mike Waltz, who will likely be nominated as well. He's not seen as a controversial pick. Mike Waltz is a neocon. He's also very anti-Russia. So I don't see this. I don't see this scenario in which the U.S. pressures Europe to just sign some kind of agreement. I think it's more likely that this is drawn out a little bit more, and then eventually they come to some kind of Korean War situation where the war is frozen, and the reality on the ground is unofficially recognized, but it doesn't become official. And that's why, I mean, how many months does Ukraine have left? Well, we're at the end of December almost. 1 month until Trump comes in. And then when Trump comes in, again, it's not going to happen immediately, but let's say it's a few months. So I honestly think that this is just, again, part of this desperation in the last months of the conflict.
Well, it's interesting you talk about conflict freeze, because now we do, as you say, we have Trump coming in, Trump administration number 2 coming in. And Donald Trump made recent comments in his first press conference since being elected, where he said something to the effect of, this is a real nasty one, but we're going to make a little progress, at least a little progress toward ending the conflict. And that's what he is supposedly going to be committed to. But it's interesting that you talk about the freeze, because on the one hand, the United States appears to be, at least Donald Trump appears to be interested in a freeze. That I think that was the initial kind of concoction they came up with. But at this defense ministry meeting, where the conclusion for Russia was that they were going to actually be preparing for war for the next 10 years. That is what Belousov said. He said, the Ministry of Defense of Russia must be ready for any development of events, including possible military conflict with NATO in Europe in the next decade. That's a direct quote. But then even Reuters is citing the fact that Belousov is saying that they are taking 30 square kilometers a day, Russia is, and they have actually taken more territory in 2024 than at any prior time in the conflict. So I'm curious, Ben, what do you think about this idea that if there is going to be negotiations, that it's likely going to be on Russia's terms, given how Russia is even just talking about the future of this conflict?
There's no question. I mean, what does the U.S. and the EU and NATO have to offer? I mean, the only thing they have to offer is removing sanctions. That's really it. And so all of the leverage is on Russia's side. And from Russia's perspective, they also say, okay, you should lift the sanctions anyway because they violate international law. We're not going to, I know we're going to talk about Syria later. This is exactly what the U.S. strategy was in Syria. We are suffocating you with sanctions. Now you should do what we want, and then we'll take off the sanctions. Well, no, you have to take off the sanctions according to international law. You can't just wage economic war against every country, although that's what the U.S. wants to do. And that's what the U.S. does. And this is the rules-based international order in which the U.S. makes the rules and orders everyone around. And 1/3 of countries on earth are sanctioned by the U.S. But anyway, getting back to the specific case of Russia, it's also, when we look at the sanctions, they, of course, have done damage to Russia, but they've also caused, ironically, some positive side effects. So now Russia's economy is growing faster than any European economy. While Germany's in recession, the UK's in recession, Russia is growing very healthily, and it's reindustrializing. You're seeing a revival of some of these formerly deindustrialized areas. In fact, the FT published a very interesting article about these kinds of Rust Belt areas in Russia. Like, people know of the Rust Belt in the US. These were the major manufacturing areas in, the Midwest and places like Cleveland, Ohio, and Detroit, that previously were centers of industry and the car companies. And in the neoliberal era, many of those jobs were taken offshore. They were deindustrialized. Well, similarly, during the Soviet Union, there were parts of rural Russia that were major manufacturing hubs, and they had local factories where people worked. And then with the imposition of neoliberal shock therapy in the 90s and the overthrow of the Soviet Union, a lot of these areas were just turned into the Russian Rust Belt. A lot of people left. There was brain drain. There were a few jobs locally. There's poverty, unemployment. Well, now what we're seeing is actually a revival of some of these local areas. In fact, some of the Western, to the extent that there were some factories in Russia that were managed by Western companies, or car companies, for instance, in the case of Japan, which also left, Russia has taken over these factories and is now making Russian cars and other Russian manufacturing goods. So this is, again, it has caused damage to the Russian economy, but this has also encouraged Russia to reindustrialize, to become more self-sufficient, and to deepen its economic integration with China, with India, with Eurasia in general. Russia is making it very clear that its future lies in further integration with Asia and not with the West. So from Russia's perspective, what do they get from negotiating with the West? The only thing they have to offer is lifting sanctions, which, as I just discussed, have actually not been as damaging to Russia as a lot of people in the West want to think. So I think what we're actually seeing here is Russia is too big to sanction, right? This is the logical conclusion, that when the U.S. has just tried to sanction everyone around the world, eventually what it does is it actually creates kind of new economic blocks that now Russia is firmly part of, this larger Eurasian bloc. So, obviously, I'm not a military expert. I don't know exactly what the military strategy is going to be, but simply looking at it from a geopolitical perspective and an economic perspective, Russia at this point is obviously winning. The fact that they're taking 30 square kilometers a day is a sign of that. So all the momentum is on their side, which means that NATO, Ukraine, the US, and the EU, they can see that the days are numbered. That's why they're engaged in these very provocative, dangerous acts, terrorist acts, because they know that they only have a few months left. So they're trying to maximize the very little leverage they have, while still cognizant of the fact that they lost and really have nothing to offer Russia.
Yeah, indeed. And, Ben, some in the geopolitical space, people who are following geopolitics get disappointed when they hear Vladimir Putin and Russia make warnings, talk about pushing red lines. They say, well, Russia is just bluffing. Russia's not going to do anything about this. And I'm curious on your perspectives on this, given what you just said, that Russia is winning right now and the scales seem to be tipped in favor of Russia. So I'm curious on what you think about this perspective that I've heard so many. I get messages about this, and I've seen this argument and debate take place a lot for those following this conflict, and mainly in the collective West. Your view?
Well, a few things. So you mentioned that quote earlier from Russian military leadership. I mean, these kinds of vague comments are made by basically every military commander in every major country. We see similar comments in China where they're saying we must prepare for potential war in the future. I mean, this is the goal of a military, right? Is that they need to be prepared for future conflict. Meanwhile, you see these insane US generals in the US who are saying that we are going to have war with China by 2025. So, I mean, you have these, the Western media loves to take comments like this from Russian military commanders or Chinese, and they portray this as evidence that supposedly Russia or China are preparing for war in the West. Russia and China do not want to expand war further. They want to focus on economic development. They want to focus on being more self-sufficient and not being as dependent on the West. And in that sense, again, the sanctions have actually helped them decrease their dependency on the West. In the case of China, for instance, I was just looking at recent data. Just a decade ago, China's exports to the US were around 7-8% of GDP. Now China's exports to the US are 2% of GDP and declining over time. So the situation just in one decade has changed a lot. And as for, you know, the possibility of NATO entering, I know there are a lot of people who say this because it sounds very interesting and everyone, I mean, there's always this urge to portray the world as being on the verge of chaos and collapse. But we should think about this realistically. There's no way that the US is going to send, I mean, the US has a few special operations forces and CIA agents on the ground in Ukraine, but the US is not going to send tens of thousands of troops to Ukraine to fight a war against Russia. That would be World War III. It's not going to happen. Now, will some European countries that are members of NATO actually send more troops? Again, they do have a small number of special operations forces, and they've been there from the very beginning. But let's think about this for a second. First of all, who would do that? Okay, let's say, is Germany going to send troops? Well, first of all, the German government right now is on the verge of collapse. It's not going to do anything. Is France? The French government is on the verge of collapse. Macron is not going to do anything like that. The UK, I mean, that's a joke. It's so funny seeing the UK act as though it's a serious military power. I mean, no one in the world is afraid of the British military. The British military is extremely, it's not well trained at all. It has no discipline. It's not going to fight against Russia in Ukraine. Give me a break. This is all bluster. It's all part of the strategy to try to threaten Russia, to try to pressure Russia to reduce its demands for negotiations, because everyone can see that Ukraine has lost. In NATO, there are really only two militaries that are significant, the US and Turkey. Turkey is certainly not going to send troops to Ukraine. They're focused on capturing the north of Syria right now.
To invade. Yes, they're about to invade. Anyway.
The only country in NATO that actually could have the military capacity to fight against Russia is the US. And they're not going to do that for a variety of reasons. Also because they're much more focused on China at this point. So I think, again, this is all part of a larger strategy. The media wants everyone to be afraid that there's going to be, and NATO is going to enter in Ukraine and is going to fight back and beat back the Russians. It's nonsense. It's childish. It's not going to happen. All of this is part of this propaganda campaign that is trying to obfuscate the fact that Ukraine and NATO have lost. I mean, they have completely lost. It's really obvious that Russia is winning, and all of the momentum is on Russia's side. And because they refuse to acknowledge that, they're just, again, I keep repeating myself, but they're trying to find leverage that they can use against Russia. And the only leverage they have left is just killing top Russian officials and putting the 15th round of sanctions on Russia, as if that's going to change anything.
Right. And when Russia makes these comments, Ben, when they talk about warning of getting ready for war over the next 10 years, preparing for war with NATO, they're doing so because NATO itself is, forever fast this comes, for whenever the potentiality, we're obviously not in that moment of history just yet, even though that Russia has said and NATO has said so many times this is a war between NATO and Russia. The fact of the matter is that NATO is, and I'll pull this up. I don't know if you're familiar, Ben, with the new NATO General Secretary, Mark Rutte. He said that NATO has to shift to a wartime mindset. And what does this mean, Ben? This means that NATO it's simply, they must spend more money. NATO countries must spend more money on the military.
He specifically said that, he said, no one likes saying this, but that means we have to take some money out of social services, healthcare, education, and spend it on the military. He said that.
Let's actually, yes, I can pull it up. Actually, we're not ready for what's coming our way in 4 to 5 years. They need to turbocharge defense spending across NATO countries. And I believe he said, where is it here? Because Russia is at a war footing. But he did say that I'm really pleading 1 billion people living in NATO territory, particularly Canada and Europe, to tell them to help me. Here it is. Call up your politicians that you agree that, yes, it is difficult. It will mean somewhat less spending on other items, but that you want your politicians, to prioritize defense because this long term is crucial. And so essentially what he's saying is give up everything for war with Russia.
Yeah, well, he didn't say Russia necessarily. They're actually preparing for war on China. Let's be real. And of course, Russia would be part of that because Russia is very closely partnered with China, and the US and the EU and NATO, they see China and Russia as a bloc, even though China has made it very clear that it does not want to engage in bloc politics. Every Chinese diplomat repeats that endlessly. We do not want a Cold War mentality. We're against bloc politics. We want win-win cooperation. But if you read top strategy documents from the US, from the Pentagon, from the EU, from NATO, the strategic blueprint, as they published, they say that China and Russia are this bloc, and then they're against both of them. And actually, they've recently expanded that to include China, Russia, Iran, and the DPRK, North Korea. And a top U.S. general, Christopher Cavoli, was testifying before the U.S. Senate, and he referred to them as the axis of adversaries. That's the term that they've used. The axis of adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. So what they're really preparing for is, I mean, it's not just Russia. It's much, much larger than that. And if you think about it, I mean, how would they actually escalate against Russia? Ukraine's military has been utterly defeated. It will not be able to fight another war for decades. And Russia has made it clear that it didn't. Originally, Russia demanded security guarantees in late 2021, before this new phase of the Ukraine war began. And they demanded neutrality for Ukraine, that Ukraine would not join NATO. And the US, NATO, and the EU refused on all measures. They did not agree to any of those demands that Russia had made. And then Russia sent its troops in and started this new phase of the war. But the point is that Russia made it clear that now Ukraine will not be able to fight a war for decades. So how would they fight against Russia? How would NATO fight against Russia? Well, I guess they could do it through Belarus. So they're going to start a war in Belarus. I don't think it's going to happen. Georgia is, of course, they're trying to do a color revolution in Georgia. But I mean, again, like Georgia is a very, very small country. It's not nearly as strategic in terms of its geopolitical location as Ukraine. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, they invaded it through Ukraine in order to break off the top part of the Soviet Union from the bottom part, to break off the Caucasus and break off European Russia from the south. I mean, Ukraine is very geostrategic. It's very, from a national security perspective for Russia, Ukraine is very, very important. Georgia is not. So again, like, if you read those documents, I don't think NATO is saying that we're preparing for a much larger war on Russia. They're preparing for war on China. That's what all of this is about. And I know there's a lot, because the war is happening now in Ukraine, there's a lot of fixation on Ukraine. But listen to every single major foreign policy speech given by any of these Western officials, well, at least US officials. Europe's a bit different because they have this obsessive hatred of Russia that is much deeper than their hatred of China. But in the US, listen to the speeches given by Blinken, read the documents published, the National Defense Strategy document published by the Pentagon. They're not really that afraid of Russia, honestly. They constantly say that Russia is a short-term threat, in scare quotes, as if Russia is going to like invade the US, which is a joke on the other side of the world. They constantly say that the real so-called threat is China. The CIA director, William Burns, Mr. Burns, he said this very clearly in an article that he published in Foreign Affairs. He said Russia is only a short-term threat. The medium to the long-term threat is China, which is why he said it's the #1 threat, which is why we've doubled our CIA budget for anti-China operations. They created an entire China room for only overseeing anti-China operations in the CIA. That's what this is all leading toward. And if you listen to the first speech that was given by the UK's new defense secretary, in his first speech, he made a similar comment saying that we must prepare. We must have like a wartime mindset. We're living in a pre-war world, is what he said. And he said we must prepare for potential war with China, Russia, Iran, and the DPRK. So Russia is part of that, but it's actually China is the real target. And it's because, I mean, Russia is a significant power militarily. It does have a decently sized economy with a good manufacturing base. But when it comes to China, there's just no country that comes close to challenging the hegemony of the United States. China has the biggest economy on earth. China is by far the world's biggest manufacturing power. China is responsible for 35% of global gross manufacturing production, which is 3 times the US. China manufactures more than the next 9 largest manufacturing economies combined. I mean, there's no comparison. So that's what this is all leaning toward, unfortunately. And of course, the Ukraine proxy war is part of that. It's because Russia has made it clear that its future lies in integration with Asia, Eurasia more generally, and not with the West. That is one of the reasons that Russia is seen as a threat to the extent that it is. It's because the whole idea after the end of the First Cold War was to destroy the Soviet Union, impose neoliberal shock therapy, privatize all of Russia's assets, sell them to oligarchs, including many Western oligarchs, and then forcibly integrate Russia into the West on an unequal footing. Russia would be subservient, the US would be on top. Of course, Russia refused to do so. Putin, being a nationalist, said, we tried to do so. He said that, we tried, and they would not accept us as an equal. So we were forced to look toward Asia. And the fact that Russia made that recognition is one of the main reasons why it's being targeted.
Yeah, and you bringing up Belarus and where are they? Where's NATO? How could they actually wage a full-scale war on Russia? I think is a great point because even now we've seen Russia, Belarus, we've seen that kind of partnership step up. Where they now, not only does Belarus have nuclear weapons that they are, handling with partnerships with Russia, but also the Oreshnik missile, which was a big deal that over the last month or so, we've seen, I think, really have an effect on, while it hasn't stopped the ATACMS and all of that going into Russian territory per se, I think we've seen the entirety of NATO and the collective West look at this as quite a disturbing development for them in terms of how do they actually get this done and how does this fit into this larger project, as you said, Ben, because this is a larger project. Russia does not stand alone. It is not the principal or only target. It is part of a general war that is being debated about how do you take out all of these countries. What did Vladimir Putin call them? Unwanted states, I think he said. All the unwanted states in the world when it comes to the vision of the United States and its NATO imperial allies.
Yeah, again, I mean, if you read, I encourage people, go read the Pentagon National Defense Strategy, read the NATO Strategic Blueprint or whatever it's called. And they say very clearly that Russia is a short-term threat. China is the long-term threat. And when they think of these countries, they think of them together. I mean, they are partners, but of course, obviously, Russia and China are independent countries. They have different views of the world. They have different policies. But when the NATO is talking about preparing for future war, they mean China. Everything is, I mean, that's really the main adversary of the US-led imperialist West. They are deathly afraid of the economic power of China, which is much more powerful than even the former Soviet Union. The former Soviet Union was a major political power, an energy power, a military power. It provided support to anti-colonialist movements across the global South and national liberation struggles. I mean, it was a major power, but economically, the Soviet Union, especially in the 70s and 80s, when it entered relative stagnation in the 80s, it was not at the cutting edge of technological production. Economically, it was not as powerful as China is today. China is the world's largest economy and continues to grow despite all of the Western propaganda. This is why there's so much Western propaganda telling us that China's economy is collapsing and all this nonsense. No, China's economy this year is going to grow around 5%, which they say is bad. Meanwhile, Germany and the UK are in recession, and the US is running, the US, which is the only Western economy that's actually growing well. And even then, US GDP growth around 3%, but the US is running massive federal deficits of 6 to 7% of GDP. So, I mean, it's all a house of cards. China is the real so-called threat to Western dominance. I mean, China does not want to threaten anyone with war. China has not been involved in a war since 1979. Its war in Vietnam, which was actually part of the overall Western war in Vietnam. It was kind of an extension of that. China does not want to get involved in a larger war. If you listen to every major Chinese diplomat, they make that very clear again and again and again. But the US-led West is preparing for war on China. And as they prepare for war on China, they're also preparing for war on China's main partners, which are Russia, Iran, and the DPRK, which, again, the US has called the so-called axis of adversaries. They're the ones pushing for war. So when we talk about the possibility of World War III, I'm not concerned about the possibility of World War III breaking out in Ukraine. What I am concerned about is the possibility of World War III breaking out when the US tries to do something against China, whether that be over Taiwan or in the South China Sea or the Philippines or Japan or who knows. But I think that's the real danger. And I think if you listen to Russian military officials, they recognize that if the US goes for this war on China, almost inevitably, Russia would be dragged into that. That's the concern.
Yes, yes. And NATO's strategic concept in 2022, at the height of the Ukraine conflict at the July summit, they say the People's Republic of China's stated ambitions and course of policies challenge our interest, security, and values. The People's Republic of China employs a broad range of political, economic, and military tools to increase its global footprint and project its power. While opaque about its strategy, it has intentions of military buildup. The deepening of strategic partnership between the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation, their mutually reinforcing attempts to undercut the rules-based international order run counter to our interests. That's a direct quote from the strategic concept. And it was noted at that time, Ben, and this hasn't changed, that this was the first time that NATO itself looked at the Pacific and said, we are going to put this as our priority.
Yeah, and that was, as you mentioned, that was the height of the Ukraine proxy war 2 years ago. NATO's rhetoric against China has become even more aggressive in the past 2 years. And now South Korea and Japan, very much not in the North Atlantic, are participating in NATO meetings, including recently the defense ministers of NATO who get together for a meeting every year. The defense ministers of South Korea and Japan also participated. So NATO is expanding into the Pacific because, again, they see China as their main so-called threat. And when they say threat, they mean a country that is actually powerful enough to challenge what Putin talked about earlier as the Western-led dictatorship in the world, which is that the West sees itself as gods. They think that they can control the entire world, that everyone must obey them. They can sanction and wage economic war against any country they don't like and try to destroy their economy, as they did to Syria, as they've tried to do for 60 years against Cuba. And now that's why they want to destroy China, to prevent the global south from actually having an alternative.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. And that is the overall project, isn't it, Ben, to ensure that the world does not have an alternative to the United States empire. And that's why it's so interesting. I think we have in terms of how the coverage is. It's Ukraine conflict is happening. China, sometimes there's news about Taiwan, but China is kind of in the background, only some commentary sometimes from these warmongers. And of course, the Middle East being so much in crisis, and there's so much going on there, which we're about to move on to. But it appears that this project, Project Ukraine, some people call it, but really it is the project to topple Russia. It really is not just a project against Russia. It is a global project to maintain dominance and hegemony.
That's absolutely right. It's a project to isolate China. Again, I mean, I'm not saying that it's not about Russia. Obviously, it's about Russia as well. But ultimately, why is Russia seen as a so-called threat to the West? It's because Russia has politically and economically integrated with Asia, specifically with China, and because Russia refused to integrate into the West on unequal footing, being a subservient part of the US-led West. And that is why Russia is seen as such a threat. Go back to the 1990s, read Brzezinski, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the leading US imperial strategist. He was previously the US National Security Advisor, who helped oversee the famous bear trap in Afghanistan of supporting the Mujahideen, who became the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, in order to wage a proxy war against the Soviet Union. Well, Brzezinski, in his 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard, he famously said that the biggest threat to U.S. dominance would be what he called an anti-hegemonic alliance of China, Russia, and Iran. Well, here we are. China, Russia, and Iran are close partners. So all of these conflicts are about isolating China, weakening China, and eventually trying to overthrow the Chinese government. Obviously, they would like to overthrow Putin. They would like to overthrow the Russian government and install another Boris Yeltsin. There's no doubt. In fact, Biden said that very openly at the beginning of this new phase of the Ukraine proxy war. He gave a speech in Poland, and he said that. But why are they so concerned? Specifically, it's about isolating China. This is also what Syria is about. I mean, it's not the only thing. Again, no conflict is about one specific issue. It's not just about China. It's not just about a pipeline. It's not just about all the whatever, Israel. It's about a multiplicity of factors. But one of the most important of those factors is trying to decapitate all of the partners of China, which is the most powerful country challenging US-led Western dominance. So, of course, all of these conflicts are very much related. You're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yes, Ben, now we must get to Syria because, as you said, Syria is interconnected with all of these other conflicts. And of course, the government of Bashar al-Assad is no more. The month of December has been a very difficult one for Syria. It's so interconnected because we have reports from the Telegraph and others talking about the Uyghurs who have traveled thousands of miles to Syria back in 2014, I believe it was, to fight inside of Syria against the Bashar al-Assad government in the Syrian Arab Republic. And now they're vowing to go back to China. But I wanted to ask you, Ben, about this overall situation in Syria. We have Israel expanding into Syria, I believe, to a proportion of the size of 3 times that of Gaza now it occupies. We also have Turkey readying an invasion, and we also have a letter from Bashar al-Assad. At least it has been verified by some. There's still some questions about its authenticity, but in it, Bashar al-Assad claims that he was at the Russian air base, that he was there until the end, and he says that at the Hmeimim air base, that there was drone attacks on that airbase, which led to actually an evacuation of everybody, Russian personnel and himself. which is what led to his ultimate arrival in Moscow. Ben, help us understand what's going on in Syria and where things are going.
Yeah, well, assuming this letter is real, I mean, it has been reported as the statements by Assad. We don't have 100% certainty on that, but he's, it was a short statement. He said that he did not plan on stepping down, that he went to Latakia, to this air base, and that he was also corresponding with the Russian military, trying to bomb these extremist groups. And then they attacked the air base in Latakia on the coast in the west of Syria. And there are a few things that come to mind. First of all, we should keep in mind that the so-called rebels, which were led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is rebranded Al-Qaeda, HTS. This group was previously Jabhat al-Nusra, which was the Syrian Al-Qaeda affiliate. It was the largest Al-Qaeda affiliate on earth. And then they rebranded, and hilariously, the US government, which has been allied with Al-Qaeda in Syria for a decade, as was admitted by the current US National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, back in 2012, when he was the top aide to Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State in the Obama administration. He published an email to her in which he said, quote, AQ is on our side in Syria, end quote. AQ is, of course, Al-Qaeda. So acknowledging that the US has been allied with Al-Qaeda for a decade. And there have been many reports in mainstream media that Al-Qaeda in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, was using US weapons. The Pentagon itself admitted that some of these so-called moderate rebels who were trained by the Pentagon and also by the CIA, which spent $1 billion a year training and arming these so-called rebels in what was the largest CIA covert operation since Operation Cyclone in Afghanistan in the 1980s that gave birth to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The Pentagon admitted that some of those so-called moderate rebels then joined Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So the point is that the U.S. has been allied with Al-Qaeda in Syria for a decade. Don't take my word on it. That's what Jake Sullivan said. And so the U.S. was supporting these groups. But ironically, when Jabhat al-Nusra rebranded as HTS, the U.S. State Department said that they did not recognize that this group is independent of Al-Qaeda. They said this is just a name change. They still recognize it as a terrorist organization, as Al-Qaeda. And now this group, rebranded Al-Qaeda, is the de facto ruler of Syria. They were the ones who took over. And the point I was going to get at earlier is that when they were taking over Syria and attacking, this is not some ragtag group of guerrilla fighters. They were very heavily armed, well-trained with advanced technology. They had many tanks and they had advanced drones, including the so-called kamikaze drones that have been used in Ukraine. And there are reports that in addition to getting support, of course, from the West, from Turkey, from Israel, they also got support from Ukraine. So once again, I mean, all these wars are not only politically linked, they are in many cases militarily linked. And there have been reports that the Ukrainian Special Operations Forces have been helping to support these Al-Qaeda linked rebels in Syria. The Ukrainian military, Ukrainian intelligence have been supporting these Al-Qaeda linked rebels. And the Ukraine reportedly also gave some of these kamikaze drones to these Al-Qaeda linked rebels. Also Turkey, a member of NATO, who always plays both sides and no one can ever trust them. Turkey has for years been giving these drones to Ukraine in order to fight against Russia. And of course, Turkey has been giving drones to these Al-Qaeda linked rebels in Syria. So as for Assad's statement, I think it's very realistic if he says that they were in this airbase that was attacked by drones. Well, these so-called rebels were getting the support of many foreign countries. They had kamikaze drones. They had military capabilities. Again, this is not just a ragtag group of Syrians who just decided to pick up weapons and then just fight against Assad. I mean, they clearly are backed by multiple foreign powers. And now that they're in power, we can see that clearly. The U.S. government has made it very clear. The deputy of the National Security Council for the White House said that the U.S. is not leaving. The U.S. has had troops in Syria for nearly a decade. They are occupying 1/3 of Syrian territory in the east, which just so happened to be the oil-rich territory. There are videos of U.S. armored vehicles with the U.S. flag patrolling around the oil fields in Syria. They were using this to starve the Syrian government of revenue that caused a hyperinflation crisis, along with the suffocating sanctions on Syria that successfully collapsed the Syrian economy and collapsed the state. So the US is occupying the eastern part of Syria. Israel is now colonizing more and more Syrian territory. Israel has already illegally held the Golan Heights since 1967 in violation of international law. Now it has expanded further. Israeli colonial occupier troops are now 20 kilometers from the capital, Damascus. Netanyahu has said he has no intention of leaving. So just as Israel is colonizing northern Gaza, it's colonizing southern Lebanon, now it's colonizing western Syria. And then you have Turkey. Turkey is also colonizing the northern part of Syria. So you have the US colonizing East Syria. You have Turkey, a member of NATO, colonizing North Syria. You have Israel colonizing western Syria. You also have the US military at the Atanf base on the border in near the southeast, also near Iraq. So, I mean, this is a country whose sovereignty has been completely violated. It's being treated like a colony. It reminds me of the Sykes-Picot Agreement during World War II, in which the British and French empires, along with the Ottoman Empire and the Tsarist Russian Empire, they carved up West Asia and said, we're going to get each little territory. It reminds me of what the Western powers are now doing to Syria today. And then they have their little Al-Qaeda linked puppets in power in Damascus. And you have Abu Muhammad al-Julani, who's now rebranded as Ahmad al-Shara. And he's saying, we want no conflict with Israel. We want peace with Israel, not saying a single word for the Palestinian people while Israel is bombing Gaza, not saying anything. In fact, these Al-Qaeda rebranded rebels are saying our real adversary is Iran. We want to help the US and Israel fight Iran. And we want to, of course, support these groups that are fighting against China, these extremists. And, there's all this propaganda in the West saying that China was lying about the extremists in Xinjiang and that it's all fake. Well, meanwhile, here we have these extremists who are affiliated with Al-Qaeda from the so-called Turkestan Islamic Party, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliate. And they're saying, yeah, we're going to try to wage war against China. How convenient. I'm sure it's a coincidence that the US government has spent decades supporting these groups, trying to break up China, trying to wage war in China. And they just so happen to now have a base of operations in Syria. Obviously, it's not a coincidence.
Yeah, it's not a coincidence at all. And it's certainly not a coincidence that these fighters, these so-called Uyghur freedom fighters, all of these so-called freedom fighters are essentially having very little issue with Israel's expansion, Turkey's expansion, the U.S. continuing its occupation. I don't know if you saw, but Mr. Abu al-Jawlani pleading the international community, please get involved, stop Israel from its strikes. Yet for years, these armed groups, which he was a part of, including ISIS and al-Nusra Front, they were not lifting a finger against Israel this entire time. I mean, how long has it been, Ben? 13 plus years?
Yeah. Well, just a very minor correction. I mean, what you said is right, but I think you're actually being too generous to Jawlani. He did not in any way say stop Israel. He said
right.
It was the weakest possible statement possible. He said, we do not want a conflict with Israel.
Yes.
Therefore, it's not necessary to keep bombing us. But he did not say, please, Israel, please, our imperial overlords in Washington, please stop bombing us. He didn't say that. He just said, no. We don't want a conflict with you. You don't need to worry about us. That's all he said. I mean, it was the most pitiful statement that a so-called leader could make about his country being bombed 500 times. According to CNN, in 3 days, Israel bombed Syria 480 times. The New York Times boasted about how Israel has destroyed all of Syria's defense capabilities. They destroyed its navy, its fighter jets, its weapons depots, its anti-missile systems, everything. They're bombing Syria back into the Stone Age, and they can barely even say the word Israel. The only time they say the word Israel is to say we don't want any conflict with Israel. We want peace with Israel because they have been supported by Israel for a decade. The head of the IDF admitted that for years they were arming the so-called rebels in Syria. The Jerusalem Post, one of the leading Israeli newspapers, admitted that Israel was treating Al-Qaeda fascists in their hospitals. So Al-Qaeda fascists in Syria were fighting against the Assad government. They would get wounded. They would cross over into Israel with the support of the Israeli military. They would be treated in Israeli hospitals for free, and then they would cross back over to fight against the Syrian government again. The Israeli media admitted that. Of course, the US has been doing this for over a decade. Turkey's been doing this. Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. And then we're supposed to believe, according to the Western media, that Russia and Iran and Hezbollah are the only foreign players involved in Syria, and that the rebels are plucky Syrians who are rising up. It's a nonsensical, infantile narrative. The Syrian state was collapsed by the West, period. There's, people can criticize Assad all they want, whatever. This is not about Assad. This is about the fact that since 2011, the United States led a proxy war to collapse the Syrian state, and they succeeded. They spent billions of dollars arming and training so-called rebels who joined Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They flooded the country with weapons. Many of those weapons also came from Libya after NATO destroyed Libya in 2011 and killed Gaddafi. And then after flooding the country with weapons, the US, Israel, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia all supported a slew of different rebel groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They took over regions of the country. They were just a bunch of gangs and warlords. Finally, Syria was able to retake major cities like Aleppo with the support of Iran and Russia and Hezbollah, who, yes, they did help Syria at the request of the internationally recognized Syrian government, which had a seat at the United Nations with a recognized government. They can ask legally, according to international law, for support from foreign countries to help them, because a bunch of other foreign countries are illegally trying to overthrow their government. The US intervention in Syria was illegal. The Saudi and Turkish intervention was illegal. Russia and Iran were there at the request of the sovereign government. Well, after failing to militarily topple the Syrian government, what happened? The US and the EU imposed an economic blockade, like the blockade on Cuba, like the blockade on the DPRK, and they succeeded in destroying the Syrian economy. I mean, for years, there have been long lines for bread. There have been long lines for gasoline, because the U.S. was starving Syria of oil that it needed, not only for internal domestic consumption, but also Syria needed foreign currency. It could sell the oil to get foreign currency to pay for imports. Like many countries in the region, Syria is heavily dependent on food imports. It does not produce enough food. So it didn't have that oil revenue. There was an inflation crisis. There was a lack of food. Then you look at government workers, military officers, their monthly wages were like $30. Why is a Syrian soldier going to sacrifice his or her life if they're getting paid $30 or $40 a month because of the inflation crisis? I mean, the U.S. succeeded in the EU, but of course, when the U.S. imposes sanctions, it's different because the U.S. basically controls the international financial system. When the U.S. succeeds in destroying an economy like this, it collapses the state. This is what they tried to do in Venezuela. And in Venezuela, I've seen the horrors of hyperinflation caused by the U.S. sanctions that just what they try to do is collapse the economy and destroy the purchasing power of people so they won't defend their government when they're under attack. In the case of Syria, they succeeded because, again, like according to the United Nations top expert on sanctions, Alina Duhan, the special rapporteur, over 90% of Syrians were living in poverty. And the West can say, oh, this is because of Assad, corruption, blah, blah, blah. Well, when you collapse the economy, when you prevent other countries and companies from doing trade with Syria because they're afraid of secondary sanctions, because why? This is the thing about Cuba. The same propaganda we've heard for 60 years. Well, why is Cuba making so many excuses? Fine, they can't trade with the U.S., but they can trade with everyone else. That's not how sanctions work.
Right.
especially given if you look at the U.S.
Thank you,
policies.
Pat. Sorry, I just want to say thank you. Continue, but thank you. Jesus, I've been hearing
Yeah.
this so much. Anyway, continue.
I mean, so the U.S. first of all, they threaten secondary sanctions. So if a foreign company does trade with Cuba or Syria or Iran, they can be sanctioned by the U.S. Look at what they did to Huawei, one of the world's biggest technology companies. The U.S. sanctioned them, and what was the U.S. excuse for sanctioning Huawei? It was that Huawei supposedly did money laundering, in scare quotes, in order to do trade with Iran, because Huawei violated U.S. sanctions, which are they're not international. They're domestic U.S. sanctions. But then the U.S. said, well, that was money laundering. I mean, it's absurd. So in the case of Cuba, the U.S. says, well, Cuba can't trade with us, but they can trade. No, because why would a foreign company risk trading with Cuba if they can be sanctioned by the U.S. and lose access to the U.S. market, which is over 350 million people? Why would they risk that for the small economy of Cuba? Very few companies are willing to do that. Foreign countries that are already sanctioned by the U.S., they say, fine, we'll trade with Cuba because we're already sanctioned. It's the same thing with Syria. Why would a foreign bank risk doing transactions with Syria? Instead, when the U.S. puts sanctions on them, they say, okay, we want nothing to do with Syria. No Syrian citizens, no Syrian companies, no Syrian importers. No, we don't want anything to do with you, Syrian banks, because we're afraid of secondary sanctions. If we even touch you, the U.S. could try to sanction us. So they don't want anything to do with it. So the U.S. put a big blockade around Syria. They collapsed the Syrian economy. No one's going to fight because the country is still in ruins, because the U.S. has prevented Syria from being able to rebuild. This was the stated policy of the former head of the Pentagon desk at the U.S. The head of the Middle East desk at the Pentagon. Her name is Dana Stroul. She's one of these ghouls in Washington who went, she was a neocon, one of these think tanks, and then she entered the Pentagon, overseeing Middle East policy. She oversaw the U.S. Congress Syria study, the congressional Syria study, and she articulated the U.S. plan for Syria. She said, we must suffocate Syria with sanctions, prevent reconstruction. She said that. Prevent technical aid from going in to rebuild, and leave the country in rubble. That's what she said, and that's what they did. So, yeah, they broke the morale of the Syrian people. There's been massive brain drain. Millions of people have left the country, including doctors and engineers and nurses, and they left this collapsed state. So, I was surprised at how quickly the government fell, but at the same time, I wasn't that surprised because they already destroyed Syria. Technically, yeah, the Syrian government was holding on, but it wasn't really able to govern because all they left behind was ruins, in their own words. And now they have rebranded Al-Qaeda. And then they say rebranded Al-Qaeda says, we're going to have free market reforms. So they're just going to pillage the country further. They're going to sell any asset that's left. It's not in rubble. They're going to sell it to Western companies. Now, Turkey's energy minister openly said in the Turkish state media that they're talking with Qatar about creating a pipeline going from Qatar through Saudi Arabia, through Syria, into Europe, into Bulgaria, and then to Europe, in order to help Europe reduce its dependence on Russian gas. They said that openly. So all they're concerned about is they just want to make sure that they can protect this pipeline in Syria. So yeah, okay, they'll maybe make a few hundred jobs for security guards in Syria to secure the pipeline they're going to build through the middle of the country while they leave the rest of the country in rubble.
Yeah, and in addition, Ben, I've seen the sanctions get very little credit or attention as to why the Syrian government fell as quickly as it did. But if we just add to the external pressure that you outlined, and a lot of the external pressure we don't even know about yet, because we know, I mean, Ben, you've covered this in your work so often. The United States and its allies, quote unquote, they stage coups. They work on this. Their intelligence agencies, every means of their disposal. And come on, we know that they've been doing this to Syria for so many years. So we don't even know what was happening internally in Syria's government. as all of these conditions that you outlined, just it just makes you ripe for the picking. It seems like we didn't expect it because all of our attention was on the horrific genocide, this march to World War III with Russia and China, the genocide in Gaza, the Israel essentially trying to expand into greater Israel, and Syria was not really in our purview. But at the same time, this is what was happening to Syria. And, there's been a lot of blame going around, Ben. Who's to blame for this? Assad is to blame. Russia's to blame. Iran is to blame. But so little attention has been placed on the fact that not only was the United States starving and successfully starved Syria, but they had Syria under siege in many other ways at the same time, even when there wasn't active hostilities. All these groups were supposedly contained in Idlib, but even so, it doesn't matter. We have to accept and understand that there was likely activities going on in the background that we may not know about for years, but we know is part of the agenda. Syria did what it had to do with the Arab League, but we know that the very same states that were shaking Bashar al-Assad's hand in Riyadh, in Doha, all of these governments were behind the initial project, or at least were a big part of facilitating the initial project of regime change.
Oh, and believe me, he knew that. Do people really think that, Assad was shaking these people's hands, and in his head, he wasn't thinking, "Oh, I hate you so much. You tried to kill me. You tried to destroy my country." It's a matter of geopolitical and economic necessity. He was going to the rich Persian Gulf monarchies and saying, "Look, we're being destroyed economically. We want you to help lobby the U.S. to lift the sanctions and help us rebuild and invest in our country." Because as the former Middle East desk of the Pentagon boasted, she said it, Syria is rubble. And the U.S. strategy was to prevent Syria from rebuilding. That was the stated U.S. government policy. And so it's no surprise that the Syrian government had lost a lot of support, despite the fact that before this war happened, Syria was seen in the 90s and the 2000s as a very stable, moderate country in the region, secular country where women had the highest level of equality out of all of the other countries in the region, along with Lebanon, which is being destroyed as well by the U.S. and Israel. And it had a society that was very well educated. It had good access to healthcare, to social services, a high standard of living. They destroyed this country, period. It will take decades for Syria to, if it does actually get back to the level of living standards it had. They turned Syria into Afghanistan. Afghanistan also had, in the 1960s and 70s, it was still an impoverished country, but it had a better standard of living today. And, you see all this propaganda about Iran, right? You see all of the Orientalists in the West, they'll post photos of Iranian women in skirts or whatever and be like, blah, blah, blah. But that's exactly what the U.S. did to Afghanistan. Why is the Taliban in power in the first place? It was because of the U.S. They did exactly what they did in Afghanistan to Syria, period. And now they use the same propaganda to demonize Iran, which has an independent government. And by the way, in Iran, women have much better lives and they're more equal than in many other U.S. allies in the region, like in Saudi Arabia. They're treated much better in Iran. In Iran, in fact, the largest number of STEM graduates are women. And there are women representatives in government that are not in Saudi Arabia. Anyway, the point is that, not to make this whole about a whole thing, but the Western propaganda, it falls apart on basic knowledge. If you have basic knowledge of the history of West Asia and South Asia and what the U.S. has done to this region, which is just try to colonize the region, overthrow any independent government, carry out acts of terror on a mass scale, support the most far-right fascist groups. Al-Qaeda was born out of the CIA operation in Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden was a loyal Western ally. As recently with the collapse of the Syrian government, the overthrow of the Syrian government, we've seen gone viral once again on Twitter, the famous Robert Fisk story in The Independent, in which he talks about Osama bin Laden, as being an anti-Soviet warrior fighting against the Soviet Union. I mean, it's so similar to what the US did to Afghanistan in the 1970s. They repeated it in Syria. And people love to talk about an individual like Assad because it can turn people's brains off. They don't think about the economy. They don't think about geopolitics. All they think about is one individual. They try to personify all of the problems in this one individual and scapegoat him. But the reality is that by collapsing the Syrian economy, they forced the Syrian government into this desperate situation where it had to look for any country who would be willing to try to lobby the US. Apparently, the UAE was working with the US to try to pressure Syria, and in return for lifting the suffocating economic blockade, even calling it sanctions is being too generous. It was an economic blockade, like the blockade in Cuba. And in return for lifting the suffocating blockade, the deal was that Syria would have to end its support for Hezbollah and cut off its ties to Iran. That was the US goal. They tried to collapse the Syrian state and they succeeded. And we've seen this again and again. I mean, what it reminds me of is also the 1980s in Nicaragua. So what happened? The Nicaraguan people in 1979 had a revolution led by the Sandinista Front. They overthrew a US-backed right-wing dictator, and they had a revolution. They created an independent left-wing government that was allied with the Soviet Union and supported revolutionary struggles. The CIA supported the Contras. The so-called moderate rebels in Syria were just the Contras, part deux, número dos, right? Exactly what they did in Nicaragua, arming and training these far-right death squads who are run by a bunch of gangs who believe in nothing except for their own personal aggrandizement and corruption. If you think the Assad government was corruption, wait until you see what Syria looks like when it's run by a bunch of gangs and warlords who, yeah, I mean, they talk about Islam sometimes, but honestly, they're just a bunch of criminals and thugs.
Yeah.
So now in the 1980s, after doing that, the CIA collapsed the Nicaraguan state. They imposed brutal sanctions and an economic blockade on Nicaragua that caused hyperinflation. The currency collapsed. Government workers were being paid pennies, like in Syria. The government lost popular support because people said, well, originally they were providing us a better standard of living, but now we can't afford food. And they blame the government because they don't blame the sanctions because, especially in that time, there wasn't that much knowledge of sanctions. But also because, look, like if you're an average person, you don't know anything about politics, and you can't afford food, and you're getting paid $30 a month, you're going to blame the government. I mean, yeah, maybe you know in the back of your mind that there's a foreign superpower that's suffocating your economy, but you can't do anything about that. What you can do is blame the government, right? So what happened? In Nicaragua, the Sandinistas, they were voted out in scare quotes, right. But you can't have an election when you're under an economic blockade and the CIA is backing a terror war that's aimed at collapsing your state. And then the US tells the Nicaraguan people, either vote for our puppet, the right-wing millionaire oligarch, Violeta Chamorro de Barrios, vote for her, or we're going to continue collapsing your country. We're going to destroy your economy and starve you. So the Sandinistas lost power. And it's exactly what they did in Syria. I mean, people really need to study history. This is not new. And it's what they've tried to do to Cuba. It's what they tried to do to Venezuela. It's what they tried to do to the DPRK. It's what they tried to do to Iran. The fact that Venezuela has not fallen is a testament to the fact that the Venezuelan government still maintains a lot of popular support. The fact that the Cuban government has not fallen after 60 years of this is because the Cuban government is still very popular. So yeah, maybe the Syrian government was not as popular, but the reality is that this is not a new strategy. If you study history, you can see this happening again and again.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up those examples too, because it also draws, I think, another lesson as well, which is, while a lot of us from the outside were looking at the stasis or the so-called diplomatic pause, freeze in the dirty war on Syria over the last several years as maybe a positive respite, a positive element. You had Russia, Turkey, Syria trying to work things out over the last several years. Two very little avail after the Astana process was set into motion. But the fact of the matter is that war that was still happening, but maybe in a pause, had such an immense impact on Syrian society that everything that you outline in that comparison, the Nicaragua comparison is especially compelling because Nicaragua was in a literal armed war against it by
The
the United
Contras
States.
were the original moderate rebels.
They were, exactly. So that example shows you that it does have an impact in Syria. The conditions, the damage, this is not to make light of what happened in Nicaragua, because the damage was obviously to people, to the economy, devastating. But the numbers, just calculating the numbers on Syria is devastating. We have millions of people displaced, hundreds of thousands of people killed. And then the United States imposed these absolute draconian sanctions which starve the economy. And then you also have a country that's surrounded on all sides by enemies. So perhaps we shouldn't have been as surprised, as much as we know this is going to have an impact on things to come, Ben, which is what I wanted to ask you before we move on. What do you think the impact will be? Because you mentioned Afghanistan, and we know that after 40 years or so of proxy war, direct occupation, destruction of Afghanistan by the United States was sent packing by the Taliban to a degree. What do you think will be the fate of these contending forces in Syria now? You have Israel expanding, Turkey, of course, preparing for an invasion, the United States trying to do some kind of diplomacy with Turkey to stop it, even though, come on, we know that Turkey is going to be going into a deepening armed conflict war with the Kurdish SDF US-backed forces. And then, of course, you have the United States, which wants to continue to occupy, although some believe Donald Trump doesn't want to anymore. But I'm skeptical of that, given that there are contending forces here that all, not Turkey and Israel maybe rhetorically, but we know that all of these three countries work together quite closely. Ben, what is going to be the impact and where do you see the future lying here in Syria?
Well, let's not forget that when Trump was president the first time, he famously did an interview on Fox News where he said like 20 times, I left troops to take the oil. We have the oil. We have taken the oil. The oil is ours. It's our oil. And then the Fox News host says, I think it's Laura Ingraham. She's like, well, you don't mean that we're taking the oil. We're protecting the oil. And he says, no, we have taken the oil. We have the oil. It is our oil. So, I mean, we'll see. Donald Trump is going to be Donald Trump. A few thoughts. What could the future look like? It's impossible to predict, but I think the future is not going to be a unified Syria. It's going to be like Libya. Look at Syria and look at a map of Syria. In fact, even the so-called rebels, again, rebranded Al-Qaeda, who have taken over the major cities like Aleppo, Homs, Damascus, they don't actually control even all of the rest of Syria that's not under US or Turkish control. So Turkey is in control of the northern part. The US is in control of the east. But also, if you look at the south, for instance, there are a group of other so-called rebels. There are pockets of areas controlled by basically what are kind of warlords, these so-called rebels, which are glorified warlords. So what happened, let's not forget, in the 1980s, the US, the CIA was spending billions of dollars arming and training the so-called mujahideen, the Islamist extremists in Afghanistan, who are like the so-called moderate rebels in Syria, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And they succeeded in overthrowing Afghanistan's socialist government, which had been allied with the Soviet Union. However, after they overthrew the Afghan government, there was a civil war in Afghanistan that continued for years. And it took several years for the Taliban to finally claim victory and stabilize the country. So is this the end of the Syria war? I don't think so. You mentioned Turkey, but there's probably going to be more infighting among the different so-called rebel groups. And then what will the government look like? I think now, clearly, Al-Julani or Ashara, whatever name he wants to use next week, maybe he'll rename himself Netanyahu to get even more Western support, right? So the point is that this HTS so-called government, which runs Damascus, does not control even most of the rebel-held areas, and there are other rebel groups that might vie for power and fight against them. they could even kill Jelani. I mean, this has been pointed out by a lot of people. Like, his security better be good, because it would be very easy to take him out and then immediately collapses into more chaos. He has obviously been advised by his handlers, who knows, in Turkey, in Qatar, probably Qatar, honestly. They have so much money. He's clearly been trained by some PR firms. He now talks to media better. He's, he's like trimmed his beard a little bit. He now wears the same clothes that Zelensky, the actor in Ukraine, wears. I mean, it's incredible how similar he is to Zelensky, right? And he now says that he's going to respect Christians and Shia Muslims and Druze and other minorities. He says, he's portraying himself as more moderate. The literal former leader of Al-Qaeda is portraying himself as a moderate. So there are two things that here. First of all, this could be just a temporary strategy. Obviously, a lot of people around the world are focusing on Syria. We know how short attention spans are. When Trump comes in a month, everyone will have forgotten about Syria. In 6 months, there's going to be almost no coverage of Syria. So then they can really go back on all of the propaganda about being moderate and go full on for their Al-Qaeda vision. That's a possibility. Another possibility is that he's killed for violating what is seen by the extremists he's allied with, for violating these, extremist views, the Salafi jihadist views, because he is portraying himself as more moderate. So he's going to alienate some of his extremist allies, unless he's already told them, like, look, this is just a temporary strategy. In a few months, we'll abandon all of this. So those are two possible scenarios. I think, again, it's very likely that they'll not be able to reunite all of Syria, and there will be continued violence. Let's look at what happened in Libya. So after NATO destroyed Libya in 2011, they killed Gaddafi in the most egregious, horrific way, backed by these, again, rebranded Al-Qaeda, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which was an Al-Qaeda affiliate, backed by NATO. And then what happened? There was a civil war. And still today, there is no central unified government in Libya. There are two de facto governments. And then the US and its allies, Turkey, are recognizing one government. And then you have the UAE backing Khalifa Haftar. There's this kind of internal proxy war going on. So Turkey backs the Islamic Brotherhood-oriented government that's fighting against Khalifa Haftar. So Libya has an internal civil war. It's still not unified. What actually happens is that basically some of the major cities are controlled by one group, and the other major cities are controlled by another group. And then you kind of have this gray area in between there, where you have these, like, especially rural areas, because people don't really care that much about controlling rural areas. They want access to the cities. They want to control the cities and access to the natural resources, and maybe ports, strategic roads that they'll have, soldiers deployed on roads, and they'll maintain barricades. But a lot of Libya is still just no man's land, right? So I think Syria will look like that. You'll have certain parts of the country that are no man's land. And this is why the US, if you listen to this US rhetoric, they constantly say, we have to stay in Syria to fight ISIS. They constantly say that. ISIS has been defeated. When they say that, what they mean is that there is a bunch of gangs, not even a bunch, there are a small handful of gangs who call themselves ISIS, who control like a small town in the middle of nowhere of no strategic importance. But even though they're there, the US allows them to continue existing, so the US can say, oh, well, we need to stay there to fight against ISIS because ISIS still exists. Well, yeah, I mean, it doesn't control anything. It doesn't control a major city. So Syria, I mean, it's not going to be stable. And from the US perspective and from Israel's perspective, they're fine with that. In fact, I recently brought back an article that I published almost 10 years ago, back when I worked at Salon. I published an article looking at a paper that was published by an Israeli think tank that was also contracting with NATO. And this major Israeli think tank published a research paper that said that the West should not destroy ISIS. And they said ISIS can be a useful tool. That was the language they used. And they specifically, in this think tank, they said that instability can be useful. They said stability is not good in and of itself. Instability can be useful when our adversaries are destabilized. They admitted it. And if you look at it from the perspective of the US and Israel, they say, fine, all right, well, in Damascus, we have people who are going to play ball, who are basically our puppets. The rest of the country will be destabilized. Israel has destroyed all of their military capabilities. They will not be a threat for decades. We'll allow them to fight their turf war, right? You know, like the gangs in cities, they'll fight over their territory, their turf. Well, they'll allow them to do that in Syria, and they're not threatened. And especially because if you listen to their rhetoric, the only country that they're actually threatening is Iran. So of course the US is happy, Iran's happy. The Syrian people will suffer like the Afghan people suffered, but you know, they don't care. That's not, imperialists don't care about that.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, that's exactly how I see it. This instability is going to be rampant. It's going to be devastating. And it's going to be quite interesting to see how these, you know, because with Libya, there also was, you know, Turkey, the United States, you know, all of these forces trying to support forces that are vying for power within the country, and really, it's still a complete and utter vacuum. It seems like that's what's happening here. Is that you have Turkey, the United States. You're going to see. I mean, of course, you have Israel trying to opportunistically expand and take advantage of this. But, you know, some people have said they believe that because Trump is coming in and, you know, the United States, it will have more of a reason to leave Syria like it did Afghanistan. In my opinion, though, one, I don't think the United States is going to want to leave where it is occupying for the very reasons you said, economically speaking. Two, the United States cannot leave a country that it's been occupying, which has other forces vying for power inside of it as well. That to me seems to underestimate, maybe overestimate the United States' so-called friendships in the world, like with Turkey and Israel, and underestimate how much the United States really does, as an empire, care about its own influence over a region, whether the chaos, even if they don't, they'll let the chaos happen, but they're not going to leave it while others are vying for territory, for power, for resources, etc.
Yeah, well, I could potentially see a scenario in which Trump makes a deal with Turkey to allow Turkey to take over that territory. I mean, but that would also be a bloodbath because the US is backing these Kurdish-led groups that have been essentially fighting a low-scale war against Turkey. So, I mean, that's why I think at the end of the day, you're probably right that the US troops will stay there. And also, again, it's not about Trump. First of all, Trump as a person, he's not, the US president is limited in how much power the US president actually has. There's a much larger bureaucracy. There's a much larger state apparatus. There's the deep state around the president. So even if Trump actually wanted to do that, which I don't think he's that committed. Two, he's picked he has voluntarily selected a bunch of neocons and hawks to fill his cabinet around him who are going to oppose that. And three, even if some of the people around him, the top level officials in the cabinet, agree to withdraw troops, you're going to have the bureaucracy in the Pentagon and the State Department who are going to drag their feet. I mean, so first, so I'll start back at level one with Trump. So as I pointed out, when Trump was president the first time, he made it very clear that he voluntarily chose to keep the troops there. And Trump is not very knowledgeable about foreign policy. That's obvious. He kind of has a gut instinct about things, but then whatever he hears on Fox News an hour ago becomes his new policy. So he'll just like flip-flop on things. And then whenever someone talks to him who sounds more knowledgeable, Trump will be like, oh, you know, that actually sounds pretty reasonable. So I'm sure he told someone, he was like, yeah, I want to withdraw from Syria. And then someone in his cabinet or an advisor said, Mr. Trump, have you thought about the oil? Syria has oil and we have the oil. If you withdraw troops, Iran could get the oil. And Trump said, oh, we can't let Iran get the oil. We have to take the oil. So, I mean, Trump, again, there are certain things that he's deeply committed to that he believes, things like tariffs, immigration. He's not going to be convinced out of those kinds of things, but this is a guy who doesn't know much about foreign policy and can easily be convinced out of these kinds of policies if he believes he wants to do them. The second, his cabinet. All right, so let's say that Trump wants to withdraw. Who in his cabinet is going to agree with him? He has selected as his Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is with 99% certainty going to be appointed by Congress because, first of all, the Republicans have a majority, and second of all, many Democrats respect Marco Rubio because he's a neocon and he's seen as like a supposedly more moderate Republican, which is insane because this guy is a warmongering maniac. But because, you know, he is a kind of more traditional Republican. So Marco Rubio is going to be overseeing the State Department. An insane mouth-foaming neocon. He gloated over NATO's war in Libya and killing of Gaddafi. He threatened to do the same against Maduro in Venezuela. I mean, this is a guy who wants to literally invade Venezuela. I'm not joking. He called for invading Venezuela. There's no way he's going to want to withdraw from Syria. Okay, Donald Trump's national security advisor, Mike Waltz, another insane mouth-foaming neocon. Watch his interviews on Fox News. Mike Waltz said that Iran is supporting ISIS, which is so insanely stupid. Like, I can't imagine having so few brain cells and actually believing that. Iran actually did the most work in defeating ISIS. Anyway, so this is a guy who he's not going to be committed. He's also an anti-Russia hawk, in addition to being anti-China. Mike Waltz, the national security advisor under Trump. So he's not going to want to withdraw from Syria. And then look at, I mean, this guy, Pete Hegseth, who will probably be, maybe not be defense secretary. He's facing his own scandals. So I don't see any evidence of people around Trump who would want to withdraw. And then the final point about the possibility of like some kind of deal with Turkey. Now, that could be a possibility because we know that Trump and Erdogan were pretty close and they would maybe want to make some kind of deal. But then what happens to these Kurdish-led groups? They're not going to go and they're not going to just like drop their weapons. In fact, what's interesting about these Kurdish-led groups is despite the fact that they have been collaborating with the US, they still maintain pretty good relations with Russia. And that's kind of their card that they've been carrying. So it's really hard to predict what will happen because if the US says we're going to withdraw and allow Turkey, they could ask Russia for support. Now, Russia might not want to do that because Russia doesn't want to get in direct conflict with Turkey, but Russia might also think that this could be a possibility of still maintaining a presence in Syria. So, I mean, it's not that easy. Like, it really is a complicated situation. Syria it's all of the evidence points towards Syria being in further chaos and being further divided. And I do not see any evidence that the US will withdraw anytime soon, that Turkey will withdraw, or Israel will withdraw. So it's going to be like Libya. But look at where Libya is in North Africa. This is in the heart. Syria is in the heart of West Asia. So this is going to be a disaster.
Yeah. And then there's the factor, too, of what a lot of people are talking about, the axis of resistance. Is it dead? Is it defeated? Is it destroyed? While this is a blow, there still is going to be, Ben, as it has happened in Libya. We don't hear about it very often. But in all of these places, there are still people. And there's still people. And people are not going to be very happy with this kind of rule, no matter how strong or in a good position they are, because we know that this is a blow again. But the instability is going to also factor into that situation, which is, I think, true from across the region, that this has been a real big plague that the United States and its imperial allies have spread across the region, and people don't like it. And so we're still going to see resistance, and that is going to, I think, also play a factor. But indeed, we do see a big retreat. Any final comments on this? I do want to get one more, maybe a short commentary on something Trump said about China. But any final comments on this, Ben?
Yeah, the axis of resistance has been dealt a blow, a significant blow, but it is not defeated. You know, as the adage goes, the axis of resistance lost this battle, but they have not lost the war. So a few thoughts. First of all, the axis of resistance has actually grown, even though it has lost Syria. Yemen, Ansar Allah, known as the Houthis, but that's the derogatory term. They're called Ansar Allah. They control the majority of Yemen, where the majority of the population lives, including the capital, Sana'a. They're not just like a small little group. They have created a state apparatus with elements of the former Yemeni government. And they have created a kind of revolution that they call the September 21st revolution, I believe. and which is when they launched their original uprising against a US-backed puppet dictator in Yemen. And they have created a government, and they have good relations with Iran. They had good relations with Syria. They also, by the way, have good relations with Venezuela, with Cuba, with Nicaragua. I mean, they've built this kind of, with Russia, like they've kind of built this international de facto alliance, even though they're not officially recognized as the UN recognized government in Yemen. So it's interesting. I mean, what happened in Yemen, that's a new addition to the axis of resistance that didn't exist a decade ago, really. And what's also interesting is that they have been supporting Palestine. They don't have to do that. They've, to much personal sacrifice, the Yemeni government, the de facto government in the north, which is where the majority of the Yemenis live, they have tried to put a kind of naval blockade on Israel to try to stop the genocide in Gaza. And they've had some success, at least in causing ships to reroute, which has also done severe damage to the Israeli economy. So that's an addition. So yeah, it is, of course, a major loss in Syria, but that's why I wanted to emphasize that, well, one country has been lost, another country has been added. Furthermore, in Lebanon, okay, yes, Israel has decapitated the leadership of Hezbollah, but Hezbollah was not defeated. In fact, the fact that Israel was forced to sign this so-called ceasefire, which was not a ceasefire, was fake, but because immediately the week after Israel signed the so-called ceasefire, it bombed Lebanon 100 times, according to the UN. It's not a ceasefire. But the fact that Israel even signed it was a recognition that it was not able to defeat Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, which is a huge development compared to the 1980s, for instance. The reason that Hezbollah was even created is because Israel invaded South Lebanon and occupied it and was trying to colonize South Lebanon. Hezbollah was created as the indigenous Lebanese resistance against Israeli colonialism. And in 2006, when Israel invaded another time, they defeated Israel. But even in 2006, Israel was able to take much more Lebanese territory and eventually bomb the hell out of Beirut and try to take Beirut unsuccessfully. The point is that despite the fact that Hezbollah's leadership has been decapitated, they're still even stronger today than they were 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So Hezbollah is not going anywhere. So Hezbollah has not been defeated. Hamas in Gaza has not been defeated, despite the fact that Israel has just completely destroyed northern Gaza. I mean, they are, of course, ethnically cleansing the north in order to colonize the north. They've made that very clear. They're not hiding that. So they can try to take more territory, but they have not defeated Hamas, which is a group that did not have nearly as much access to weapons and military technology that Hezbollah has had, because Gaza is so geographically isolated and it just completely blockaded by Israel. So Israel has not defeated Hamas. They have not defeated Hezbollah. Iran is, of course, still intact with a very powerful military. Yemen is now part of the resistance axis. Iraq has multiple resistance groups that have been involved in actually launching strikes against Israel and its allies. So yes, they did succeed in helping to overthrow the Syrian government. That is a major blow. We should not, beat around the bush. It's a major blow. But again, there still are many other parts of the resistance that are active. And finally, although it's very bad for the Syrian people, the fact that Syria is going to remain in this state of chaos and internal conflict and civil war like Libya, that also means that because there's going to be territory in Syria that's basically not under central control, it's going to be a bunch of warlords vying for power. It also makes it possible to continue sending weapons through Syria into Lebanon and potentially Palestine. So that was one of the reasons that Syria was an important part of the resistance axis, is because even though Syria was not directly waging war against Israel because they were afraid of the consequences of sanctions and war, and we saw what happened to them. Their state was destroyed through all of that. They allowed Iran to send weapons through Iraq, through Syria, into Lebanon, into Palestine. And the fact that Syria is now going to be in the state of chaos means that those weapons can probably still be sent. So again, we should be realistic that this is a blow, but we should not be this. I've seen too much defeatism. People saying this is the end of the resistance axis and Palestine is doomed. No, as long as there is oppression and Israel is more and more oppressive, more and more overtly fascist, run by these maniacs who are calling openly for genocide. The finance minister who said that we should starve all 2 million Palestinians in Gaza to death, but unfortunately the international community won't let us. That's what he said, Smotrich. I mean, like, these people are fascist maniacs. The more and more extreme they get, the more and more they only create more domestic resistance in Palestine, in Lebanon. So yeah, I mean, the loss of Syria is a loss, but until the oppression ends, the resistance will always continue.
Yes, yes, indeed. And yeah, Syria, a lot of people are talking about it. Syria was a real, for all of whatever errors I've seen people make. I've been disappointed in a lot of the responses to Syria because, like you, Ben, we've both been talking about this war as a regime change war. And, Syria did have this value to it, to the axis of resistance, as one of the last Arab countries, or at least Arab-led countries, diverse country, to, hold up the mantle of independence and national liberation. And it did play that central role. And so, I've seen a lot of people making criticisms about Syria's decision-making in the recent years, even claiming that it was against the axis of resistance. And I haven't bought that one bit, that it didn't want to send weapons, advanced weapons it was holding for Hezbollah to Hezbollah. It was, at a critical juncture when Hezbollah opened up a front, Syria didn't want to open a front, completely negating the fact that Syria was indeed not in any position to fight an open war with Israel. And now we see that, it actually wasn't at all in a position to do that come 2023.
It was literally fighting for survival. I mean,
exactly.
And one quick point. I know you wanted to continue, sorry, but just on this idea that Syria abandoned the resistance axis. In fact, the reason that the Syrian government fell is because it did not abandon the resistance axis, period. We have reports from Reuters that say that the U.S. was using the UAE as their negotiator to pressure Syria, and saying that in return for lifting the illegal sanctions and economic blockade they imposed on Syria in violation of international law, Syria would have to end support for Hezbollah, and it would have to cut ties with Iran. The fact that Syria refused to do that is why the government fell, period.
Yeah. Yeah. And, all this defeatism, as you said, Ben, is just so unhelpful, not least because the information is still so sparse about the concrete details of what happened. But we can put two and two together. We can see what was going on, and we can see that the biggest problem was the axis of real evil, the empire, the United States, Israel, Turkey, NATO, all of the Gulf countries, all of these, they were all the real problems for this, when it comes to this regime change war in Syria. And then when you look at the blow to the axis of resistance, I think a lot of people do negate. I'm glad you brought up Yemen and framed it as an addition to the axis of resistance. I think people really do underestimate the fact that when countries or imperial state, maybe imperial states like colonial states like Israel and Turkey now with its Ottomanist dreams, neo-Ottoman empire dreams, when they roll dice like this around Syria and achieve the initial success as they have in Syria, there are consequences to this. I think your argument about the arms still being able to flow into into Lebanon is a good one, because it assumes, the argument against that assumes that these groups, these rebels, quote unquote, the armed bandits of these governments, of this imperial alliance or consortium of states, maybe better yet said, it assumes that these groups are just going to do the bidding of Israel, are going to do the bidding of Turkey, when in fact a lot of times what you have is these groups actually vie independently for power, and they're really difficult to control once they are let loose. And we've seen that in Libya. We've seen that all across the region. We saw that in Iraq after the 2003 invasion. While the United States of the empire and was okay with it, it also was not able to control the situation. They couldn't control the situation in Afghanistan. And so I think that the Axis of Resistance is more equipped, better prepared, as you said, than it was prior to October 7th, 2023, and prior to the last several decades. And this is not something that's new to the resistance. And also the resistance still has, as you said, with the addition of Yemen, a lot of room to grow in ways that we cannot simply understand, because not only are we not there, but we cannot predict such things. So I do think that the doomerism, the defeatism has been quite, I think while I understand it comes from a real place, that there has been a blow suffered, I think it negates so many factors that you've outlined and that are completely getting overlooked.
Yeah, very well said. And we could say more, but I know you wanted to talk about other issues as well.
Yeah, so I wanted to play one thing for you, Ben. I mean, you can give a short commentary if you want on this, to the conversation of Trump part 2. Donald Trump, he says a lot of interesting things. He talks a lot. He just had his first press conference after being chosen, or after being selected, I should say. And he had this to say about China. And now we've covered Trump's policies toward China and Trump's foreign policies during his first administration, and we're very critical. But this is an interesting statement that I think I'd like you to talk about the contradictions and complexity of. Here's what Trump had to say about China.
Because China and the United States can together solve all of the problems of the world, if you think about it. So it's very important. And, he was a friend of mine. I mean, he was here for a long time, right in that spot, except sitting in a very comfortable chair. He wasn't standing like you are. But we spent hours and hours talking. And, he's an amazing guy.
Have you spoken to Venezuela?
The press hates when I say that, but he's an amazing person.
So who is the amazing person?
One of the few things that I agree with Donald Trump on. Xi Jinping is an amazing person.
Xi Jinping is the amazing person. Ben.
Yeah. So should I just go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead.
So a few thoughts. Obviously, I mean, this is welcome. Like, it's very rare to hear Trump say something that's not antagonistic against China, because, the day before or a week before, he's just threatening tariffs and sanctions on China. And saying China is taking our jobs and China is sending fentanyl and all this nonsense. So it's good for once to hear something positive. But there are also a few thoughts that I think should be kept in mind. First of all, there are people now calling this the proposal for a so-called G2, that the US and China can just sit together and make decisions about the world. That's not how China sees the world at all. China is very much opposed to what it calls the bloc mentality. It does not want to see itself as a new hegemonic power. In its foreign policy, China is always very hands-off and non-interventionist, to such a degree that sometimes people wish that China intervene a little bit more. But no, it's ideological. China is committed to non-interference, and China deeply believes in multilateralism and multipolarity. So China doesn't want to just sit down with the US and decide what should happen in the rest of the world. But of course, China does very much want to improve its relations with the US for a few reasons. One, China does not want a war. Despite all of the propaganda you'll see in the Western media, I assure you, I have spoken to a lot of Chinese foreign policy intellectuals and professors. And in China, academia is a bit different. Unlike in the US, where you have a lot of academics who are ignored by the government unless they're an insane mouth-foaming warhawk, in China, academics are very highly respected and are often government advisors and play an important role in foreign policy decision-making. And, I have spoken with so many of them, and I'm living here in China, and I can tell you that they do not want a war, that everyone is concerned about the possibility of war with the US, not because they think that the US would destroy them, but because it would be catastrophic for the world. They think they could defend themselves, but it would be catastrophic for China. It would be catastrophic for the US. It would be catastrophic for everyone. They truly believe in this idea of win-win cooperation. It's not just rhetoric. They do believe that it's possible to have an arrangement in which the US and China both gain, but also other countries gain. So, I mean, I think that people in China, when they heard that statement from Trump, of course, they welcomed it because they welcome improving of relations with the US. But also, I think they're probably a little concerned in the way that Trump framed it as the US and China at the exclusion of other countries. So that's one point. Another point to keep in mind is that it's good to hear Trump say that, but at the same time, once again, all of the people Trump has surrounded himself with in his cabinet are insane China hawks. Marco Rubio is the head of the State Department, mouth-foaming anti-China hawk. Potential Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, anti-China hawk. His National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, another insane China hawk. So it's the same issue that happened in the first Trump administration. Trump would say these kinds of things, and then he would sit down with Mike Pompeo, his Secretary of State, and John Bolton, his National Security Advisor, whom he voluntarily appointed. You know, there are people who in his first term, they love to make excuses for Trump, saying he was forced by the deep state to pick neocons. Well, what's the excuse this time? This time he says he's going to fight the deep state, and yet look at the people whom he voluntarily chose to be in his cabinet. I mean, they're all China hawks. Every single person, even the people who are not involved in foreign policy decision making, including in his treasury, including in other parts of the government, they're China hawks. In fact, if there's one thing that unifies all of them, they might disagree on Russia, for instance. Some of them are Russia hawks. Some of them are more friendly or sympathetic because they want to focus on China. For instance, Vivek Ramaswamy, who's going to head the whole Doge thing, which is a joke because they're not going to actually, I mean, that's a whole other conversation. But it's going to be like Ronald Reagan. They're going to say they're going to cut the government deficit, but actually they're going to increase the government deficit by cutting taxes on the super rich, cutting taxes on corporations. They are going to cut education and they're going to cut the very few social programs that exist that actually help poor people. They're going to cut food stamps, but the deficit's going to increase because they're going to spend more on the military, and the tax breaks on the rich and corporations are going to increase the deficit. Anyway, the point is that Vivek Ramaswamy, a billionaire, his whole foreign policy strategy when he was running for president, he said that we should have a deal with Russia. We should improve relations with Russia in order to focus on isolating China. That's his whole strategy. So all of the people that Trump is surrounded with are not pro-China in any way. So again, I mean, Trump is one of those guys who he'll say this thing one week and then the next week he'll say the exact opposite. I think it's positive. I'm glad he said that, he made that comment, because it's a sign that he's not trying to push for war on China, which would be catastrophic for the world. But again, it also comes after a few weeks after he said any country that de-dollarizes, we're going to put 100% tariffs. Well, China is de-dollarizing. Is he going to put 100% tariffs on China? Who knows? I mean, it's impossible to predict.
100% tariffs on China. Watch the global economy, in that amorphous term, go boom.
Well, not the global economy, the U.S. economy.
The U.S. economy, yes, the U.S.
I
economy.
mean, look at all of the products the U.S. imports from China. 100% tariffs, they're all going to double. I mean, it's a joke.
It'll be a disaster. And no, I mean, you know, Trump saying this is an interesting development. We know, though, and your contacts in China, my contacts both in China and here, they are all worried about his first 90 days because there is obviously a lot of talk. Trump is talking about Ukraine, obviously wanting to move away from that, at least in some form. But we know, and I think China is well aware, they have not been happy with the Biden administration's policies. But they also remember it's not so long ago that Donald Trump was president. And Donald Trump's administration escalated tensions with China to their worst point, perhaps in the history of the two countries having normalized ties. So that is something that I think China is still expecting. And I think your point about this whole G2 idea that people are floating being ridiculous is a good one, because yes, China is never going to sit atop any kind of platform or forum where it says that it is dictating affairs for the world. It will never do that. I'll bet every single dime I have that as long as China has its current government and leadership, it will never do such a thing, because that is anathema to everything that China is working for around a community with a shared future, as they say, and one that isn't dictated by block mentality and blocks at all. That actually its project of building multipolarity with other countries is to have a more egalitarian international order at all spheres, economically and beyond.
That's absolutely right. If you look at, I mean, I agree with everything that you just said. A few points. If you look at the China global initiatives it has created, three of them: the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative. This is part of this idea of trying to create a world with fewer borders, metaphorically, in the sense that, like, trying to create less conflict so countries can work together on behalf of development, security, and civilization, respecting their own cultural sovereignty. So, I mean, this goes against China's fundamental foreign policy principles. Another point that I was thinking of when you were speaking there is that China, the Communist Party of China, is deeply committed at its core to opposition to hegemony. That's the term they use, bachuan, which is very important because when China normalized relations with the US and Japan in 1972, it's forgotten, but that China, well, that was when they normalized, before they officially the US and China normalized in 1979. But of course, with the Richard Nixon trip to China in 1972, and they signed the first communique of the three communiques. When they did that, China, part of the negotiation was that China was demanding what they call the anti-hegemony clause. And this was demanded not only of the US and Japan, but other major powers when China normalized relations with them. In the agreement, they said that they wanted both sides to commit to being opposed to hegemony. And you can go and look at the agreements that China signed with the US and Japan, and they're in there. Ironically, the US signed this, which we know that the US is not in any way opposed to hegemony. But China wanted that in writing. This goes back to the very foundation of US-China diplomatic relations, is opposition to hegemony. This is how foundational it is for China. So China has made it very clear. If you listen to Chinese intellectuals, if you read the statements of Chinese diplomats, if you read the reports of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, they always say that their goal is to create a world without hegemony. When they talk about multipolarity, they're not talking about a world of competing hegemony, where you have, North American hegemony and Asian hegemony and European hegemony. They want a world without hegemony. That's the whole idea. And it's a kind of historical thing. It's complicated. Part of it's lost in translation. They don't really use the word imperialism that much. 帝国主义. That's the Chinese word, that because it's associated with the Mao era, right? Like in the Mao era, like Fandi was like anti-imperialism is very much associated with Maoism. So the Communist Party today, because they've tried to distance themselves from the kind of ultra-leftist Maoist era and the Cultural Revolution, instead they say opposition to hegemony. But when they say hegemony, they really mean imperialism. That's what they really mean. They just, again, because of historical reasons, they don't say 帝国主义, imperialism. So China, the Communist Party, being a communist party, is deeply committed to this. It's not just a rhetorical flourish, but because the West tries to, they refuse to understand China. They portray it in a particular way, saying that China is, that all of the Communist Party has abandoned Marxism, which is not true, that the Reform and Opening Up initiated by Deng Xiaoping in 1978 was abandoning socialism. It's not true. That socialism with Chinese characteristics is just capitalism by another name. It's not true at all. It's absurd. People can go to my channel and watch my videos in which I explain how China's socialist system works. It's not the same as the Mao era. It is very different. It's certainly not the same as the Soviet Union. It's very different. But they have a deep ideological commitment against hegemony, against imperialism. They don't want to carve the world up into spheres of influence. And the US does. Well, actually, let me take that back. The US doesn't want spheres of influence because the US wants to control the entire world. They want full spectrum dominance. They don't want any near peer strategic competitors, in their words. But those two views are incompatible. So at the end of the day, this is why, again, I think it's good to hear these kinds of statements from a US president, but it's just rhetoric. I mean, Trump is the kind of guy who will say one thing and do the other. I mean, it's impossible to predict what this guy will do. One other final point. I'm glad you mentioned that Biden has also been horrible for China. And if you listen to Chinese intellectuals, the common phrase that they were using is that choosing between Trump and Biden, choosing between the Republicans and the Democrats, is choosing between two bowls of poison. That's their translation in Chinese, two bowls of poison, which in English is, pick your poison. So they recognize that it's not about one individual. It's not about Trump versus Biden. It's about the fact that the U.S. state apparatus, the ruling class of the United States, the capitalist class on Wall Street and in Silicon Valley, they are deeply committed to having more and more competition, in their words, with China. So, yeah, Trump can say this, but if Trump's going to put massive tariffs of 60%, as he pledged, on all Chinese goods, I mean, what is he going to do? Does he expect that he puts 60% tariffs and then he expects that President Xi will just sit down with him and act as though they're good friends and they can just sort this thing out? No, that will be seen as an act of economic war. And again, this is how Trump, he thinks that he's such a savvy strategist. And he says, I'm going to threaten these massive tariffs on foreign countries, and then they'll come to the negotiating table. Well, if you already put the tariffs on them, I mean, why would they negotiate with you? They will negotiate with you once you lift the tariffs. Like, this is the whole thing we were talking about Ukraine earlier. Like, this whole strategy of the US and the West is that they're going to launch a brutal economic war. They're going to try to suffocate your economy and then force you to make deep strategic concessions in return for lifting these sanctions, which are illegal. Like, this is Russia's whole point. Russia's point is that you must lift the sanctions as a precondition for negotiations. It's not something that we'll give to you as a condition. No, that is the precondition. And for China, it's the same. Trump says, oh, okay, we're going to try to suffocate the Chinese economy, and then we'll sit down and negotiate. No. The precondition for the negotiation is stopping the tariffs and sanctions. So again, this is just like, this is the problem in the West, and especially in the US, is that they think that they can force everyone to do what they want. But we're no longer in that world. They're no longer that powerful. You're muted.
Trump even invited Xi Jinping to the inauguration for Donald Trump. And my initial thought to this was, why would a Chinese leader come to the United States and sit and celebrate the inauguration of a president who already has a long track record of not just being anti-China, but being so hostile to China that we are now speaking about the possibility of war between the United States and China, of course, instigated and initiated by the United States, more now than we ever have been. And the Trump administration number one, 2016 to 2020, was a big reason for this. Just on that premise alone, let alone the fact that it's been a long time since there's been any kind of strong diplomacy between the United States and China, including the Biden administration, and including, of course, the deterioration after the first half of the Obama administration. So it's just so interesting that Donald Trump says this without even indicating, like he has with Ukraine, for example, peace deal, right? We're going to work on a peace deal. That at least is something tangible that likely is going to be a failure because what the United States is probably going to offer is not going to be whetting Russia's appetite. The fact is that the Trump administration is offering zero to China. Zero. There's not actually, the only thing he's ever said about China is more tariffs, as you said. He's not offering a scale back in the militarization of the Pacific or Taiwan. He's not offering any kind of anything economically, politically, diplomatically, militarily to China, other than, oh yeah, let's talk. You're amazing. You'll get a seat like you did back in the day. And of course, his knock on the media. You're all standing, but Xi Jinping, he was, he was sitting. He was sitting because he was a welcomed guest, right? Like playing on that. But the fact of the matter is Donald Trump in his administration should be seen as an administration, as you said earlier, should be seen as having completely attached to it that deep state, and should be seen as an administration controlled and run by the same forces, Wall Street, these forces of capital, and the military-industrial complex, which sees a huge profitable opportunity in militarizing the Pacific and moving toward war with China, as completely attached to this Trump administration, and will likely move forward on a path to war with China for these reasons alone, let alone the what we are learning now, I hope more people are learning, are the fundamental differences of governance, which the United States doesn't really like to doesn't ever tolerate, hasn't tolerated in its history up until this point. Any final comments, Ben, before we close up?
Yeah, a few things. You mentioned the economic interests, especially, the military-industrial complex. There are these reports that for his deputy defense secretary, Trump has nominated the billionaire Steve Feinberg. And who is this guy? He's a major investor in the military-industrial complex. He's made billions of dollars off of the U.S. arms industry. So again, these are the guys who are going to be overseeing the Pentagon. So the idea that they would push for peace with China is laughable. A few other points that you made that are really important. This goes back to the Obama administration. I want to be clear to people. People will say, oh, we're just we're just blaming everything on Trump. It's bipartisan. It was the Obama administration. In fact, it was even the first Obama administration with the Hillary Clinton State Department that started the so-called pivot to Asia. And ironically, they were the ones who also tried to have the so-called Russia reset, where Hillary Clinton met with Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, with a red button, and they tried to reset Russia relations. We saw how that went. And their goal was to reset with Russia to isolate China, which was exactly the Trump administration's strategy. And they're still talking about that today. Meanwhile, Russia and China are closer than they've ever been, literally than they've ever been. Even in the 1950s, when the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China were close, they were not as close then as they are today. Now, Trump, right before the election, he did an interview with when it doesn't matter. He did an interview in which he said that he wants to break off Russia and China. Trump said that the goal, he said, why is Russia closely partnered with China? So here we are where Trump says he's going to try to do this again. But again, it's not realistic. It's not going to happen. One other quick point on this, which is that on the issue of China and how their diplomacy works. So China, their diplomacy is very conflict averse, is the way I would describe it. It's very different from Russia's diplomacy. In Russia, their diplomats are very good. They're very skilled. Sergei Lavrov is one of the best foreign ministers in the world. And Russia likes to with countries that are kind of swing countries that could play different sides, like Turkey, like Saudi Arabia, Russia tries to really improve relations with them. But then when it comes to especially the West, Russia is just they accept that the West is doomed, that they're never going to have good relations with them. And they have this very adversarial relationship, which a lot of people in the global South respect. They like that about Russia. Russia has been very supportive of Iran, of Burkina Faso, of certainly Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. Russia is seen very positively because it's willing to stand up to the West. Now, I'm not saying that China is not seen positively in these countries as well. It is. But China's foreign policy is very conflict averse. China is always trying to improve relations, despite the fact that it knows that the West, they know deep down, if you talk to Chinese officials in private, they know that the U.S. they will not ever have the U.S. like the relationship was in the 90s. Like they're never going to go back to that. That the U.S. is dedicated to overthrowing the Chinese government. They know that. However, they also recognize that time is on their side. China continues to grow. It is very powerful. And China wants to minimize conflict in order to increase its power economically and militarily to such a point where they're no longer even concerned about Western threats, because it's just the West is no longer a threat to them.
Yeah.
So because time is on their side, they will do anything they can to try to reduce tensions. And that means that sometimes China will make concessions that Russia would not be willing to make, because China, again, recognizes that in a decade, in 20 years, the size of the Chinese economy, I mean, the U.S. economy will be, it'll pale in comparison. And then the technological capabilities of China, the military capabilities. So regardless of whoever won the U.S. presidency, it was inevitable. I think China is going to try to, at the beginning of this new administration, I think in the first year, despite all of the very aggressive policies Trump will take, China will probably still take a very conciliatory tone of just trying to improve relations. That's what I expect. But they can see where things are going. And, Trump will make comments like this, but the fact that Trump invited President Xi, but President Xi he rejected that invitation, is a sign that they can see clearly where things are going. So people shouldn't be confused, because I've seen people, especially on Twitter, who criticize China for just like not just going full on war with the West or whatever. First of all, that's not how China operates. China and Russia operate in a very different way. But also, China is really thinking of things in the longer term, not just in 4 years of Trump. They're thinking 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now.
Totally. And the attempt, we're going to close here, but the equating of Russia and China's positions are just ridiculous, because people forget that in 2022, when Russia launched its special military operation, over the past 8 years, right on its borders, NATO itself was organizing not just what's happening on Taiwan, which, well, is not fate. China doesn't like it. China doesn't want to see U.S. arms and all that interference in Taiwan. China understands. There's nobody on mainland China you'll find who's like, oh man, we're really concerned that Taiwan is going to launch an attack that's like gonna really disturb Chinese society. Like, no one thinks that at all. But Russia, given that it wasn't just Ukraine, but all of NATO surrounding it, building up what was Ukraine? A million plus? I don't even know how big Ukraine's military was before the special military operation. It's huge, though. It's huge military. With NATO advising, NATO training, weapons, all of that. That's a real threat. Like that is a legitimate existential threat right on your border, not to mention all these people who speak Russian, who identify as Russian, being killed for 8 years after they had to determine that they wanted to be independent after the 2014 coup. Much different than Taiwan. China is at a much different position, and China is such a unique place to go to. I've spoken to people who will laugh at the potential of who think it's funny that Taiwan or any of this kind of war stuff, it could be seen as beneficial to anybody. And we'll also be the first to say, yeah, well, if there's a war, we're going to join and we're going to defend our country. Like that is a different mentality than I think people have a hard time understanding. That people will laugh at the idea of a conflict because they think it's so catastrophically stupid. But at the same time, if there is one, and I think, China's leadership, the CPC, and a lot of people in China, they know that the United States wants a conflict, or at least is building up toward that, and are going to be willing to defend themselves when that time comes. But nobody wants it. Why? Because, as you said, Ben, it will be a catastrophe for everybody involved. Nobody is going to be better off for it afterwards. So all the thumping about China needs to be more aggressive, it's like, why? Why would China do that when it can continue to progress? It's like asking Russia to just, roll tanks into Kiev and, right now. Well, why would you do that if you're in a favorable position, if you're able to maintain stability, if you're able to address problems in your country, if you're able to defend your sovereignty? Well, why would you do that? So I think people just need to ask that question to themselves when they think about China, wanting China to take steps that they would want to take, because understandably so, they're frustrated by the overall situation. Really, they're frustrated with the United States and the collective West. That's really what they're frustrated.
Yeah, well, this is the perfect note to end on, which is that time is on China's side. And China, it has the world's largest economy. It is the world's manufacturing superpower. Its economy has been larger than the US in terms of GDP measured at purchasing power parity since 2016, according to IMF data. And China produces 35% of the world's manufacturing gross output, which is 3 times the US. It's larger than the 9 largest manufacturing economies in the world combined. I mean, I often repeat those statistics just to get an idea. It's so overwhelmingly huge and influential. And China is the largest trading partner of most countries on Earth, of over 120 countries on Earth. And over time, its economy continues to grow much faster than the West, which Europe is in economic crisis and stagnation. China's technological capacities are growing very rapidly. It's catching up very rapidly with the US, which is why the US Commerce Secretary under Biden, Gina Raimondo, said openly, she said, our goal is to prevent China from technologically innovating. She said that. Biden said openly, he said, we are going to prevent China from becoming the wealthiest and most powerful country on Earth. He said that. That's the US goal. We want to prevent China. I mean, China already has the biggest economy, but the reality is that time is on China's side. They recognize that. They also don't want conflict. They don't want war. Again, I need to stress this. China has not been involved in a war since 1979 with Vietnam, which was a very tragic war. It was a very brief war, about a month, and it was essentially an extension of the Western war in Vietnam. It was an outgrowth of that war and the wars in Cambodia and Laos. So China does not want war. It has avoided war. It wants time to continue to develop. The US does not want to give China that time to develop because they can clearly see. They saw it back in the Obama administration, which is why they declared the pivot to Asia, because they saw around the late 2000s that China would soon overtake the US as the largest economy, as a major manufacturing power, and specifically that China moved up the value chain, because the whole deal, when the US allowed China to integrate into the US-controlled international financial system, the deal was that China would remain subservient, like they wanted Russia to be subservient, right? Under Yeltsin. And the deal was that when they allowed China to join the World Trade Organization in 2001, they wanted China to produce cheap manufactured goods, cheap consumer goods for the West. But the US would maintain the high levels of high value added production, high technologies, and importantly, intellectual property monopolies. Because we live in a global capitalist system that is based on a global division of labor in which you have a few imperialist countries at the top. And what is their role in the system? The US is the banker of the global financial system. It protects the wealth of capitalists around the world. The US stock market now represents 70% of the entire stock market capitalization of the entire world. Capitalists around the world invest in US assets and US stocks and bonds and real estate. And the US protects the wealth of the global capitalist class. And in the neoliberal era, they outsourced the low-level production of low-level manufacturing to the global south, especially to China. And the deal was China would make toasters and toys and t-shirts and shoes for the US. They wanted it to stay like that. Maybe China would make cell phones, but importantly, the intellectual property monopoly would be held by Apple. And yes, Chinese workers would make those cell phones, but the vast majority of the profits made through that process would be made through the rents held by the intellectual property owners. That's the majority of the profit, because maybe they spend $100 on all the materials and the labor making the iPhone, but then they sell it for $800. You have these massive profits, and those profits go to the US or to Ireland or wherever, because, for tax reasons, but it goes to the West, right? But China said, we don't want to be simply your low value added manufacturers who just make your cheap consumer products and you make all the profits. We want to have our own domestic industries. We want to produce high value added products, and we want to produce our own technologies, our own cell phones, our own computers, our own electric vehicles, our own solar panels, our own semiconductors. And now the US, what are the US tariffs on? At least under Biden. Trump's going to expand them further. The US tariffs are on electric vehicles, semiconductors, solar panels, all of the areas where the US does not want China to compete. They don't want competition. They wanted China to remain at the bottom of the totem pole, or maybe in the middle of the totem pole of the International Division of Labor. And the US would remain at the top of the totem pole. The US would do artificial intelligence and weapons and finance and marketing and Netflix movies, all of the intellectual work that involves not that involves the actual physical labor at the bottom of the supply chain. And China didn't want it. Like Russia said, China said, we want to be equals. We don't want to be the new hegemon, but we don't want to be subordinated to the West, the US-led West. But of course, that's not what the West wants. The US wants to subordinate China like they wanted to subordinate Russia. And the people of China have said, we refuse to be subordinated. We went through a century of humiliation. We saw what it was like to be subordinated by the Western colonial powers. That's why we had a revolution in 1949. That's why we've lifted 800 million people out of poverty. And that's why we continue to develop, and we want to be a prosperous country. And unfortunately, the imperialists in the West, led by the US, they see that as a threat to their chokehold on the global economy. And the real danger is that they're pushing for war. It's not China that's pushing for war. It's the West, led by the US, that's pushing for war, because they can see that time is on China's side. Time is not on their side.
Well said. Well said. Well, we're going to wrap up now, everybody. This has been an epic episode, as it usually is, with Ben Norton. Be sure, as we leave here, to go to that like button and hit the like button, because that will continue to boost the stream well after we are finished here. Also, go to the video description where you can find Ben's channel, Geopolitical Economy Report. You can also find all the ways to support this channel from Patreon, Substack, and many other options. I just want to say thanks to all those who gave super chats. Marvin asked you, Ben, do you think Jordan or Egypt are going to face uprising next?
Well, I'll answer very briefly. There are many reasons in both countries for the people to rise up, but you forget that unlike Syria, Egypt and Jordan have regimes that are strongly backed by the West, close U.S. allies that receive a lot of U.S. support and so-called aid. Egypt is the second biggest recipient of so-called aid after Israel. Well, Ukraine has changed the statistics, but historically, Israel was the top recipient of so-called U.S. aid, followed by Egypt. So the U.S. has tried to prop up these regimes. Jordan is a complete joke. It's a monarchy. The U.S. loves to talk about democracy.
Yes.
Jordan is a monarchy run by a king who barely even speaks Arabic. People joke that he speaks Arabic with a U.S. American accent, because English is his real, not mother language. I mean, he's a complete U.S. puppet. He's helped Israel. Like when Iran responded to Israel in self-defense, attacking Israel in response to Israel's attack, Jordan helped Israel fight against Iran. I mean, it's a complete joke. It's a puppet of the U.S. So it has no legitimacy. The regime is very unpopular in Jordan. There should be an uprising. However, if there is an uprising, you can count on the U.S. supporting the Jordanian regime and Israel supporting the Jordanian regime in trying to repress the uprising. So it's the exact opposite of Syria.
Oh, the exact opposite. Jordan. People forget that Jordan, during the independence period across the region, the CIA was literally trying and succeeding in it had so many kings in this monarchy, and the CIA had a huge role in forming that initial government, and that's why it acts the way it does. For how many decades has it been? It's almost entirely a CIA creation, as a bulwark against what was at that time the very strengthening movement toward independence in that region. But Ben, it's great to be with you. Everyone, hit that like button. Go to find Ben's channel and all the places to support this channel in the video description. We are out of here. Thanks for tuning in. Good night or good morning, wherever you are. Bye-bye.